Record on this computer. Oh,
Yay.
it's recording.
Alrighty.
um, so could you introduce yourself and just say a little bit about what you do?
Oh, that's going to take a while.
That's all
So
right.
I'm Luticha A Doucette, and I live in Rochester, New York. I love it here. And currently, my 9 to 5 is equity coordinator for the city of Rochester. So, really looking and creating policy and looking at our practices and procedures leading with racism, but understanding that like equity is like all these intersecting ideas, right? So I'm not a Black woman on a Monday and then queer on Thursday and disabled on the weekends, right? Like
Right.
come together as like whole entire beings. Um, and making sure that as government, we're kind of reacting to that and making sure that we're proactive about what we're doing and how we're behaving. Because many of the racist policies were either reinforced by government or created by government, right?
Right.
So I've been doing that work for about 3 years now, which is cool. Outside of that, I am a published author. So I've written many, many articles, etc. Um, and I'm trying to write a couple of books right now, which is cool, as well as doing like some creative, artistic things, really talking about that intersection of art and racism
Hmm.
and trying to kind of subvert that. So that's a couple of projects that were put on hold due to COVID.
Yeah.
And then I have my own business. So, really taking what it is that I do at the government level and now working on how to just do and be on my own. So, making sure that I'm doing all of that. And an advocate for over 20 years on disability justice and talking about, why we need to have an inclusive society and how everyone kind of contributes to ableism in some sort of way. So that's, I think, a lot of what I do. And then I'm obsessed with my cats, which I think every cat person is. So I'm not unique, but I think mine are pretty cool. So there's that.
And you were saying earlier one might fluff by, might come by through the
Yeah,
screen.
please be patient if we're in the middle of talking and a fluff comes into the screen. She really likes Zoom, but she's kind of mad at me right now.
Oh no. Well, how did you get into the equity coordinating and work in disability justice?
So I was disabled in a car accident in 1985. I was 22 months old at the time. And I think that, really impacted my family, not just my immediate family, but my extended family, and really like changed the trajectory of my life. So I've had to fight for a lot of things, starting from a very early age, like how to advocate to dumb doctors who don't want to talk to you, and I was always just that kid, that mouthy kid that always got in trouble.
Right.
Um, so that really kind of was a benefit to being an advocate because I wasn't going to take any crap from anybody, right?
Right.
I did not care if you were bigger than me or, had more degrees. I was just not about to do, I was just
Right.
always that kid. And I think my parents tried to encourage that as much as they could, right?
Yeah.
But also my mom didn't really like that. So it was just kind of like these kind of competing things that happen. So always talking about, your opinions must be rooted in fact. You must be able to argue effectively for your, whatever it is that you think, right? It's not just, well, I feel this, so therefore it's true. You
Right.
need to critically think and kind of argue through in order to get to, a final answer. And if your final answer isn't rooted in like human rights, etc., you did something wrong. So you need to go back and rethink, why it is and not be, selfishly minded. But I
Right.
come from a big family that is like huge in social justice, etc. So I was just kind of steeped in it all the time. And even then, as a kid, my mom, ironically, is a Republican. My dad is a Democrat. And so you always got that bipartisan, how to talk through issues, etc.
Yeah.
Um, I grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh
Oh,
um, and CNN and all this other stuff. And so, really, what it did for me was kind of like shake how I thought about things and understanding how to argue to the opposite side.
right.
And I was also always scientifically minded. So, I had wanted to be a medical doctor. Life did not turn out that way. So I got a degree in bioinformatics from Rochester Institute of Technology and was doing a lot of like, lab work, scientific work. It was really fun, really cool, but like something was missing the whole entire time. Like I loved my job, hated the environment, and I was always kind of saying, well, this could be better, right? And being told, who do you think you are? I'm like, but I got rights, like you can't just say no. You need to make this inclusive so that I can do my job to the best of my ability. And some things happened, and I left to go into government and was working at what was then known as like the Office of Innovation. And we were going to solve poverty in Rochester. And I'm like, "Oh, okay. Um, you know, we're the ones to do it." Which I think, kind of arrogant on my part, not knowing exactly, like things, but it's different than you're in the system and now trying to impact the system internally, right?
Right.
And so that is very different from being an advocate where you think, like you should just do this and blah, 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 and you protest and da, da, da. All these things are great. Um, Internally, though, it's a different bag, right? And it's a different kind of push. And you can be a sledgehammer, but also you have to learn how to be the knife too.
Mm, mhm.
So, um, knowing when to push and pull or just stay silent and let things unfold, I think that has taken my advocacy to like a different level. And so that's kind of how I started in like the equity space. We were approached by the National League of Cities to do this thing that they call the Real Initiative, which is race, equity, and leadership.
Mhm.
And this came out of the uprisings out of Ferguson, where many cities were saying, hey, what do we do? How do we stop this from happening here? All that stuff. And the National League of Cities kind of realized that elected officials aren't really knowledgeable about race and racism and how that their decisions are impacting their citizens. And so they're like, okay, let's kind of start like this exploration and learning community. And then they realize it's not enough to talk to the elected officials. Like you actually need cross departmental teams internally to kind of look all across the institution to be able to make the changes, right? It's not just you tell the mayor to do something and then ish happens. And I think that's kind of where a lot of our protesters seem to miss. There's like a gap in learning, right?
Right.
It's not you scream at the mayor, you put pressure on the mayor, and then like everyone just is like, okay, mayor, we're gonna do like
Yeah.
that's not really how it ends up being in reality, right? And I had to learn that quite quickly. Like, oh, well, systems change internally is like a bunch of moving parts, a bunch of moving personalities. And even if they say they're on board, they're like, not really, right? Because they're concerned that they're going to lose their job. So having to approach this in a way that you have to acknowledge the humanness of everyone in the room as you're kind of moving this work, right? That
Right.
sometimes a policy or a practice internally might have been created because someone was frustrated about their job and were doing the best that they could. But that was like 30 years ago, right? And so
Mhm.
you've been doing the same thing over and over. And now society has changed, but you have not. So it's about getting people to recognize that change doesn't mean a loss of job. Change in behavior doesn't mean you lose power, right? Change means that you're more empowered and more capable. and you can actually be happy at your job as well as serving citizens in a way that is equitable.
Right.
So that's where kind of like a lot of the friction, et cetera, that I've been coming up against as I've been doing this work. Um, and especially with really hot topic departments like our police department, et cetera, and understanding where like the problems are within that particular organization, and how knowing what I know on the inside doesn't match what the rhetoric is from the community. And so my goal is how to get them to come together, to say like we are more powerful as a collective to be able to move the changes that we need to see in our communities. If this is what we want as the end goal, then what can we do to get it there? Some things you need to do by force, right? And some things don't. And so how do we kind of collectively move? And I think that's where the big opportunity is, right? You know, I'm a radical at heart. I want, you know, accessible, affordable housing. I
Right.
want, you know, why do we pay for water? You know, what is land and land usage and land ownage? You know, what does it mean to actually be anti-carceral, right? Because that comes with it certain things that I think our communities aren't ready for, right? What are the models and ways for things like how to prevent rape and child molestation from happening,
Right.
right? What are the things that we need to be doing as a society? If we say we're ready to police ourselves, how can we
Right.
govern ourselves as a community? If we're still hurting from internalized racial oppression, right? Where we'll pop off at someone and shoot them because, oh, they disrespected me, right? That means that before we can police ourselves, there has to be an element of healing to it.
Right.
So what
Right.
does healing look like within the community, and how do we move forward with that? So it's like all these questions that I think about on a regular. I like wake up at 2 in the morning and journal about this stuff. And how am I reflecting those values, right? Because if I am not in a state of constant healing and growth, right, I
Mhm.
cannot show up in the room and say, you know, we got to do X, Y, and Z. I'm a hypocrite, right?
Right.
I got to acknowledge my own ish.
Right.
And I can't be telling other people what to do, because one, I have to recognize my positionality in government, right? So that's why oftentimes people don't hear me speak about things in ways that I think they would wish they would hear me speak about. And I was like, but I right now am a representative of government. And my goal is to reshape gatekeeping, is to reshape how government sees itself and sees its community
Mhm.
and work with. So, you know, it's kind of like this weird, not neutral thing, because like clearly you can't be neutral in anything, but how do you kind of move and groove things? Like some things you might not hear me speaking on because I'm doing stuff over here,
Mhm.
right? And I say that's a distraction. I can't, like, I need y'all to do this thing so I can do this thing over here, right? And then when we can come together, you know, I'll put out like as a thing, we got to do this, or please help me do this. So
Yeah.
that's where I kind of sit on, you know, certain things that's going on and how it like interfaces with my work. And I
Thank
have really bad allergies, so
That's okay. It's even I've been having allergies here. Like I feel like every time I go outside now, and that didn't used to be a thing. So like I wrote down some questions. Thank you for sharing all of that. And I'm really excited about the work that you're doing, and I'm really excited about the piece about the part this. I feel like not a lot of people talk about the healing that has to happen. It's like we're always aiming for like like dismantle the police, period. uh and then like or whatever the issue is, it's just like then it's like there are all these other things that aren't being dealt with or even asked about or talked about. And like you were talking about, like that actual healing, like starting with ourselves and our communities. And like um I see that all the time. Like something I've been thinking about a lot is just like how we all get to be, how we all hopefully get to be whole people. And so that means with temperance, like reincorporating our chaotic stages and everything else in a healed state so that we can become whole people. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, like how, especially for people who aren't working in government and stuff, because I know I get the feeling a lot of times of like I want to do more, and I feel like I need to be in those places, but I don't have the skills or experience to be in those places, but I do have the experience and skills to be where I am, if that makes sense.
Mhm. It
Um,
does. I think, the first part is like I said, recognizing like the humanity of where people are in their
mhm,
own. So what I hear a lot in government is why are the protesters doing X, Y, and Z? And I have to push back and say, well, ask yourselves why they're angry in the first place. Like let's actually see our citizens that we serve, our residents that we serve as human beings who have been going through a lot,
mhm.
right? And that, this was a powder keg that was already there, and you just needed one thing to kind of like ignite it all, right?
Right,
It really highlighted a lot. And I kind of saw protests coming, like it was on the horizon, and I was trying to tell people, like, we got to be doing this. We got to push a little, like, we have to accelerate what it is that we're doing. We
right,
can't go, like, oh my God, crisis, right? And kind of sit literally paralyzed, right? I was like, no, 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 we have to keep moving. There are things that we have to do.
right,
Um, I think that was like the first thing internally to kind of say, like, you have to actually be ready. Um, People who stay ready never have to get ready. That's kind of one of my mottos, right? The other thing is with the healing component is that we had last year one of our community members, Melanie Funches. She's called Mama Mel in our community, and she is amazing. All centered around like mental health, and her tag is like healing for the village, right? So she brought in what is called emotional emancipation circles. And
yeah,
so that is a framework from the Community Healers Network, as well as the Association of Black Psychologists. So they created like this kind of like 12-step program for racism,
mhm,
basically.
mhm,
And we were trained as facilitators. So we were able to launch that this year, in the midst of COVID, to be able to at least start that journey of healing. And it's talking about like, how do you manage your emotions? How are you seeing how racism is showing up for you, internalized racial oppression? And then how are you acting out, in to either your family, your friends, and your community, and really giving people tools on how to correct that behavior, because that is a part of healing. It's not like woo, right? It's
right,
not, we're not all holding hands singing kumbaya. It is, saying like, I as a Black person and my own individual, and I have to work on my stuff. You have to work on your stuff. And where things that are common and where we align, we can work together. But you
yeah,
can't work together if you're constantly beefing, or you are showing up in some kind of way, acting some kind of way because you're feeling some kind of way, right?
right,
So that's kind of where we've been doing a lot of work around that and trying to expand that work. The other thing, like, I really teach advocates, etc. First, kind of find ways to heal, and then find your lane. And then you
mhm,
can find other people who are going to share that lane with you, right? Maybe you got a carpool together, and you have to organize around issues of race and racism in a very systematic way. So we've brought in the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond,
mhm,
which is started by Ron Chisholm, who's worked with, the Black Panther Party, Angela Davis, like all like these different like civil rights kind of like folk have used this like methodology.
mhm,
And he and James Dunn, who is dearly departed, created like this method, and they say, they're part of a movement, right? They're there to give people like a foundation, and it is centered in community. So we're trying to find ways to get dollars so community can sit in on these teachings, right?
right,
And inculcate it, and then they can take the tools that are given to them to say, well, my bag is healthcare, well, my bag is education. Well, my bag is government, right? And so now people are kind of self-selecting into the areas that are, a good fit for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell people never take on like more than 2 or 3 issues, right? Because you can't do all the things. So
Right.
you're going to wear yourself out, and that is not a good space to be. You can't help others, right, when you are empty. So you've got to
Right.
make sure that your own tank is full before you can go out. You can't pour from an empty cup. And I
Right.
think Black women, and I am so guilty of this. I'm tired. I've taken on so much. I'm doing everything for everyone else, right? Pour, 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 and then
Yeah.
wondering why my body breaks down. I'm exhausted. I'm just sitting there going, like, oh. But then I got to show up to work, right? In these meetings with people, and I got no energy, right?
Right.
The other thing I think of is learning what your trigger points are.
Mm-hmm.
And I got tested this week, and I think I failed tested. That's okay. In that, pointing out where my triggers are and knowing what they look like and how they show up in the room. So I'm not, going like, right? I
Right.
have to be strategic in how I speak and how I move. And if I need to go off, I'm going to go off on someone in a way that is impactful and resonates with everyone in the room, right?
Right.
You can't do that when you're constantly angry, etc. And I think there's a difference between rage and anger, and how to be able to kind of use your emotions as tools, as really great weapons, right? When you're inside, of all of this. And I think that's what healing for me looks like, that I'm able to manage my emotions, show up in the way that I need to, when I need to, and utilize my emotions in the proper context, right, in order to get the work done, right?
Right.
Also, just being okay with things like crying, like, because sometimes, like,
Yeah.
it's just gonna happen, and you can't be ashamed about crying in the middle of a meeting if it's like, or after a meeting, you just sit there with the cat going like, oh my god,
Yeah.
so things like that. So I'd say, like, as an advocate, like, you got to start there and start with you, and then figure out, pick and choose, like, what is it that you want. If healing is like who you are and what you want to do, like, explore that further, explore that, with more people. How can you bring in groups of healers? Like, one of my things that I saw, I think it was like a couple years ago, were like protest chaplains, and a group of Black folk were training people on how to be a protest chaplain. And so what that role served was like a spiritual healer person, and you could be from any faith,
Uh-huh.
to be there at the protest, right? Because this is, fully charged energy, emotional thing, to be able to pull people, and give them kind of like some sort of respite. So, like, and you would be where like the medics were, right? So you have
Mm-hmm.
the medic station, but you would have the chaplain in there, right? And so I was like, that is such a cool concept. And I was like, oh, I would totally do that. So I don't know if that's like a thing that people are doing, this time around, but I think it's that concept of like, how do you heal? Uh,
Yeah. This is exciting to me too, because I was just talking with someone about whether it's a healing community or protests. Like, there's often more leanings towards catharsis, and often in spiritual communities and like meditation groups, or you go on a ayahuasca trip or whatever it is, church, like, um, for you to go into that deep trance state, or even the catharsis, into a catharsis, there's usually a group of folks who help keep kind of a safe container for those things to happen, and so that people can come back to the earth, so that
yeah.
they can come back safely. And so this, having like a chaplain, like a protest chaplain on site, like reminds me of that. Like, can you talk about that a little bit more? This
So
is like new to me.
yeah, I think I say I'll have to like try to find the article again, because for me it was a new idea, but I kind of think of in the same way that because our protests are like beautifully organized, and I think it's great. They start with there's an educational component, like a teach-in, right? So making sure that people understand the how and the why, making sure there's math. Like, I think they're wonderfully organized.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it would be cool, like, what if there was like a group, like hundreds of people participating in a meditative kind of thing, before and after, right? Because
Yeah.
you're in this, you're being attacked by the police, etc. And so you have the initial meditative state in order to kind of like ground everyone. You go in, and then when you come back, there is another way to kind of bring your energy down, etc. And
Yeah.
even through it, as people are being tear gassed or whatever,
Right.
at
Right.
every medic station, right, you would have like a couple of these people to kind of help people. Your body needs to be healed, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you've just been attacked, but you've also been spiritually attacked.
Yeah.
So you need skilled people to be able. You could tell, like, I play a lot of RPGs and whatnot, right? Like,
You need a healer in your team.
like
It's the truth.
Tier 3 and all this other stuff. Be able to kind of like make it all work, right? And
Right.
so I think that would be like super cool. If I could play a lane, like that's one that I would be really interested in doing. But yeah, like how do you heal, right? And what does that look like? So part of that I would imagine is also teaching healing components at the protest,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because each individual is still not a whole human being and does not see themselves as a whole human being.
Yeah.
Uh, and if we're talking about my liberation is rooted in your liberation, well, my healing is also rooted in your healing. So
Yeah.
how
Yep.
do we, en masse say these are the standards of behavior that we expect you outside of the protests to work on, throughout your life, right? How are you actually showing up? How are you actually inculcating what it is that you're doing, etc.? And when you screw up, because you're a human being, and like, let's face it, we're all bound to screw up. Nobody's perfect. What does correction look like, right? To get back into the things that we need to do.
Right.
And we've been talking about this in our healing circles that I lead. We just went through all the principles of Ma'at,
Awesome.
and really we took time to define them, not just list them, but
Right.
what does it mean? If you're talking about truth, but you've got like 50 different opinions on what truth is, then, it's meaningless, right? So defining for ourselves and collectively defining and agreeing to those definitions, right? And these are the ways that we're going to govern ourselves. So
Right.
if you're kind of outside of, the bounds of order, right? You're out of order, which is one of our other community moms loves it. She's like, you're out of order. And you're like, right? What do you need to do to get back into order?
Right.
What does it look like, right? What are the steps? And talking about that. And I think that goes back to, community policing and community justice. What does, and we talk about the concept of Ubuntu, right? And part of that is, if some sort of hurt has been done,
Right.
right? What does it look like, for justice for the one that was harmed, right? That does not include a carceral system. What does that look like? How do you define it? And how do you make sure that it happens like consistently, right? So all of these different things are kind of like what we're exploring within these circles to be able to say, okay, like now you're expected when you're out there in the world, you now know what Ma'at is. We've now defined it. We've witnessed it in front of each other, right?
Right.
So now if you out there on these streets acting some kind of way, right, it is my duty and responsibility to be like, hey, like, keep me in mind, you're out of order, right? And
Right.
so I think like, and you have to also be like receptive to that type of, because we always like mind your business and da da da, like what I do, whatever. But that's not community oriented and centered,
Right.
right? It's not being nosy and negative or whatever.
Right.
It's, you know, it takes a village to raise a child, but I firmly believe we're all children, right? And that adulthood is when you transition onto the other side. That's how I see it, right? So we're in this constant state of learning and growing, etc. So you need community to be able to kind of get you back in some sort of grounding, alignment, etc. Or else, like,
Right.
what are you doing? I think a lot of people are out there just doing
Whatever. Yeah.
whatever,
Mhm.
thinking that is, rebellious or free, etc. But
Right.
you're not even grounded in yourself, right?
Right.
And I think of things like great music like jazz. You can't freestyle without understanding the basics,
Right.
right? So if you're just thinking that you're scatting, you're just making a whole bunch of noise because you don't know what you're doing, right? Cool, it could be on American Idol, right? So it's just kind of, these are the things that I sit and say, okay, how am I moving? How am I doing? And now bringing that into my advocacy, right? And into the work that I'm doing. Because if I'm talking about equity and all this other stuff within government, well, we had better align to principles of my aunt. We better educate people. We better create systems of accountability, et cetera, within government. So when someone kind of comes out of bounds, you've got to be able to check people internally.
Right.
And how do we teach our community to hold us accountable? Because that's how effective government works. Is not when it is in conflict, with community, but when it is in concert with community. And that when we kind of step out of bounds, community comes together and say, hey, that's not okay. And that's not a fight, right? That is
Right.
a conversation. And that is kind of the state that we need to get into.
I love that. And this is like absolutely holistic because you're like I see you seeing it from all the way inside and every gradient on into the outside. And so like I see things in Venn diagrams and circles sometimes. So like there's this whole and right. And then like in the center maybe you could say it's government. I don't know if that's like a correct vision of it, but like it's just like every facet of how the inner workings. And then when we're outside we don't know how the inner workings work. We think, yeah, if we just contact the governor then it should be okay, like my voice should be heard. But that's the thing is like I remember like a city council meeting, even just a city council meeting, if you leave after you say your say, they're going to make whatever decisions, and there's not the pressure of community to hold them accountable to whatever they want to see pass. Like nothing, like it's an influence, I guess, is what I'm saying. So I'm like, I'm not articulating it very well, but I see it as like, it's just so cool to be able to see how you're thinking holistically, like truly holistically, and not compartmentalizing all the different parts. It's like it feels really fluid, even though each person has a role. And so it's like moving it, tell me if I'm wrong, but it feels like it's like moving towards this clarity and like these are my strengths. This is what I have to offer. This is my scope. These are the knowledge and skills that I have, and this is how I can serve, and
Yeah.
also how I can collaborate, also, and that's just so cool. I
Yeah. Thank you. I feel like
Yeah.
I'm really moving and growing into my purpose and seeing, my mentor says that, like 2020 vision is about having foresight and clarity,
Yeah.
right? And that this time that we're in, I see it clearly. I see the end goal very clearly, and I see, the steps to get there very clearly. So a lot of this is kind of like, I have to look top down, bottom up, out in, and in out, right? And having this 360 view at all times, and
Yeah.
then saying, this is how I'm moving. And where I have deficits because I'm only one person and I'm flawed, right?
Yeah.
Bringing in the people with the skill sets, in order to get things done and relying on them and saying, I trust you to do the work that you know how to do. I'm not going to sit there and micromanage you to death. I'm going to
Right.
give, these are the marching orders. And they're like, bet, we can move forward and do this.
Right.
So, and wherever I see deficits in myself, I say, is this a skill that I need to learn? Is it a behavior that I need to change? Or maybe I just need to accept it, right? Like, and say, because some things, like, if people are like, everything about you has to change. No, some things I'm actually okay with, and then say, how do my flaws get turned into strengths,
Right.
right? If I'm known as very, like, blunt, spitfire kind of person, and that's like negative, I'm cool with that. I was like, course. But if those behaviors are rooted, right, in those principles and in the community, that's a good thing. When
Right.
they're rooted in my own ego and selfishness, etc., that's where I need to correct myself because it's not about me, right? We're trying to push forward this huge change at all different levels. So that is kind of where I struggle. And I struggle also with, like, I have very high expectations from myself and others. And when they don't meet them, right, I can get frustrated and all that other stuff, but also I need to, like, remember, like, okay, when I am giving a correction to someone, it's not as a judgment, it's not as a negative. It's saying, I believe that you can rise to this, and I need you to rise to this
Mm-hmm.
because you're capable. And how can I help you if possible? And if I can't do it because I'm tapped out or whatever, I need to find other people to be able to support those to get to these levels. So as you're thinking holistically, I'm also tagging other people. So, they say you lift as you climb, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Who are those younger Black women? Because that's kind of my bag, right? You could be cis, trans, whatevs.
Yeah.
And having to tag them and say, okay, I am going to mold you to be a leader, right? And I've got to also focus on your growth and your development. So a couple of them, we're creating, like, growth plans, mentorship plans, etc., so that, like, and I'm putting them in positions of leadership. So, like, you got to push, I got to push you out to the front. And, that's scary and nervous, but, like, they are succeeding and growing. And that's, like, really cool to see because, like, you have to be thinking about, like, I want to not be in the job, right?
Right.
If you're in a position for like 30 some odd years or whatever, I'm like, what are you doing? We all should be working to get ourselves out of jobs and out of positions, right?
Yeah.
That's part of the problem is you've got, like, stagnation here and change needs to happen, but this is saying, oh, I want to protect my own power, etc. I got to secure my bag and keep that bag,
Right.
rather than saying that change, evolving, etc., is good for the organization and it's good for citizens, right?
Right.
That's kind of like where my thoughts lie. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that does help. Excuse me. I I have like so many questions I wrote down here. I I wanted to connect it more, but I do want to get back to like self advocacy. I remember, I mean, obviously I've been to the doc and like have to self advocate a lot because like it'll just get steered in some strange direction sometimes. A friend of mine who had chest surgery, they had to absolutely advocate for them the whole time. And I remember I stayed with them a couple of nights and it was just like, it was a parade of doctors with differing levels of care and attentiveness, and an ability to be in that space. And also some of them were judgmental, so there are all these different things. And through the grog, through like the fog of whatever medication or whatever was happening, they had to try to remain as clear as possible to self-advocate and also have someone there with them the entire time. And like, I know that's like one or two examples, but you hear these stories all the time of just like strange and maybe sometimes terrible things happening because people weren't able to advocate for themselves. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit in the medical sphere. Um, yeah.
So that's like a huge thing, right? I nearly died as a result of doctors dismissing,
Mm.
saying, oh, well, you look fine. And me going like, that is not a medical diagnosis. Of course I look good. Like, this is how I show up every day. It doesn't mean there's not a problem, right?
Right.
And so, and just like you said, here you are, you're sick, you're overly medicated, etc., and you're going to have to fight through all of that
Mm-hmm.
because people out here aren't listening to you. And again, the things that I have learned is because I always ask questions, but why? Why are there various levels of care? Why do medical professionals not listen, etc.? And I will tell you, it's because of the system. This is how the system is set up to operate. And this is how, particularly doctors, are socialized. And part of it is a protection mechanism. If you're going to be seeing people who are sick day in, day out, many of your patients are going to die, right? Not through any fault of your own. That's
Right.
just part of dealing with medicine, right? As to protect yourself, you've got to emotionally remove yourself, right?
Right.
And they teach them very early on, right? And notice the language that many doctors will use, right? It's very like this passive voice,
Yeah.
very removed. They'll talk about you as if you're not even there, right?
Right.
Patient so and so is experiencing blah 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 blah, and they blah blah blah, and you're like, hello,
Right.
and there could be a whole group of them standing there going like, nobody will like look at you. No one gets down to your level. Like,
Right.
and they'll use all these medical terms, and you're just sitting there going like, okay, right?
Right.
So that's part of the dehumanization of doctors, right? They will start as eager, I want to, help and heal people. Very rarely does anyone go into this field intending to hurt anybody. So I think like that's like the first like huge lesson that I had to learn. Again, you've got to see the humanness of the people who are harming you too, and that's very difficult, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
then you have systems that, especially like in medicine and science, right? My success as a scientist is on me, right? Me. The number of grants that I get, the peer-reviewed research into like high articles, in journals, etc. Your turnover, like all this stuff, right? That is science and medicine. That's what it is. And you then can get tenure, etc., and then you can do like whatever you want. But your success is only rooted in your own success. It's not rooted in the success of your peers,
Right.
right? So, and I think this was like, I don't know. I know it's propaganda, but the Netflix documentary Lenox Hill,
Mm-hmm.
where Dr. Langer was like talking about how he changed things to a cooperative model where the success of his colleagues, is rooted in his success and vice versa, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how difficult it was to have that shift. And part of the issues that he experiences as chair, he said, I remember mouthing the words along with him. It's not the patients, it's people, right? You can go in as a surgeon, right? Do your thing, right? That's what they live for.
Right.
Is to you as the individual being healthy and successful, right? That's where they get their endorphin rush is, when they're in that surgery and they're doing their thing and they're moving and grooving, right? Absence of like all these politics, it's you and the doctor, right? And their skill to be able to help you. Um, that's what they live for.
Right.
And that eaten out of them, right? Because they've got to deal with people with competing interests, insurance companies, hospital policy, all that other stuff. So all my years of being an advocate, understanding all of this, right? And so now it's begun to change to say, and I ask doctors, who is helping you to be the best doctor you can be?
Mm-hmm.
And scarily, the answer is like nobody. There's no
Yeah.
one really doing like continual professional development. There's nobody doing like that. We call it cultural competency, which I think is a weird term.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you be a people person, right? And you can have, the introvert, they're not really good with people or whatnot, and they're still a really great doctor.
Yeah.
So, what is it about that individual that makes them great? And how do you then say, okay, this is the standard when we're accepting people, right? It's not just a standard of how well you could do a surgery. There should be also a standard of like how good you are with patients,
Right.
as well as having the system support you in that, right? This is why we have like I call it like it's almost like porn, right? Those shows where like we're gonna put the patient first and we'll do whatever it is that we want with like the inspirational music of like these doctors doing whatever it is that they want for the patient, right?
Right.
Because like deep down, that's what we wish the field would do for us, right? And so how do we make that into reality? And then like as like a patient, sometimes you got to train your friends on how to advocate for you,
Yeah.
right? What are the things like you should know your friends' medical records, their medical history, like the back of your hand, and it should be, back and forth. So if we talk about mutual aid, right? It's not just one person, right,
Right.
that should sign up for you. Like, how do you gather your friends to say, we're going to sit down and teach each other our medical stuff? And so, if one of us is in the hospital, you can then advocate on our behalf, right? And
Right.
sign all the papers necessary. If you got to have 5 different health proxies, have 5 different health proxies.
Right.
Got to be able to um, educate folks because life happens, people happen, right? If one person can't make it, you're not worried, right?
Right.
You've got a whole community that you can rely on to be able to sit with you, and that sense of safety, right? That you can lay back and just be sick, right? And like this other person is gonna like handle it. And
Right.
we society only reserves that for like spouses.
Right.
Like make that make sense for me. And we do not take the onus on our own to say it should be my family, whether chosen or blood or both, right? My friends, my community. And how do we kind of create like these health advocacy circles? Like, again, like that's where I envision. And it's something that, doesn't really happen in practice.
Right. And this is particularly important for a lot of us who, you know, um, who've, I know for me, like for way too long, I bought into the whole idea of individualism. And I mean, being independent is one thing, but just like there's like this story tied to it where you're supposed to do everything on your own, right? Um, and um, and so like for me, the idea of community is fairly new, and I'm starting to see like why. I mean, I think I've always yearned for it and known why it's important, but more and more is becoming apparent why it's important. And it's because there are a lot of issues that we're but just by existing in the world, we're like a political billboard, like whether it be a person of color or queerness or disabilities or whatever it is just like how do I get my needs met? Um, and the answer that I've always heard has been like, you figure it out. You just figure it out. And uh, uh, so I really like this idea of like actually like we. That's what I'm thinking of is that term accountability. Like accountability is much broader than most of us talk about it. It's also like learning how to be better people, obviously, but part of that is actually like, how do we take care of each other better? And this is exciting for me because like for a long time I haven't seen this except for a niche communities, like maybe the Latinx healing community. It feels pretty strong, and in a lot of ways it's almost, it's not impermeable, but it's pretty insular still. Like you can still receive help from it and stuff, but there's a soft wall around it, and it's a wall enough to, like, you know, obviously to protect lineage and stuff like that too. But like I just feel like in a lot of ways for me some of these things haven't been accessible, like just the idea of community. So like maybe that's what I'm trying to get at, is like how do you start building it, like from block one?
You know, that's something that I've been wrestling with for quite some time. And I think for me, part of my healing journey, I was like so steeped in whiteness. Like
Yeah.
I look back at like the photos of myself, like, okay. Um, and so part of that is a decolonization of the mind,
Hmm.
and starting to remove yourself from whiteness.
Right.
And I think community is where you're at. So I see my friends as community. Now,
Hmm.
we're still pushing up against, you know, monogamy and like the societal version of what monogamy is, right?
Yeah.
It's okay to be monogamous, you know, if that's your thing, that's your thing, but
Yeah.
understand the socialization that like your needs need to be met by one singular person, and
Right.
you put that one person above everyone else, right?
Right.
That's, you know, the antithesis of what being in community is,
Right.
right? So we have to really wrestle and dismantle that too. Secondly is to get people who are of like mind, who, you know, talking with your friends to say, you know, okay, these are the things that we say for ourselves, how we will support each other.
Hmm.
And one way it's like people will do like a susu group, right? Where you're putting your money in, one person collects it, right? And there has to be a lot of trust in that,
Yeah.
right? You know, everyone gets, you know, money out of the month, right? So like there's that one way of doing it. We could say, all right, we're gonna support each other with food, right? Particularly with COVID, right? You had a
Yeah.
lot of like, I'm gonna call them pseudo mutual aid groups, because some of the behaviors within the groups were like,
Hmm.
that's not what mutual aid is. And so having people that you can trust, like one person gets all the food for the group and then you like distribute it, right?
Yeah.
Or you know, you say, I'm going to get groceries for this person, and then it moves down the line. Or in the disability community, you know, it's about caregiving, right? Who's going to like, I have that issue right now. I have a wound, and like I only have one person coming to help me. And that is like, but what if that person gets sick with COVID? I would then, you know, what would happen, right? People only want to come to each other and help each other when there's an emergency. I
Right.
think as Americans in general, we're really good at emergency response, like
Hmm.
really, really good, right? But what we're not good is at the long term commitment to each other, right?
Right.
That revolves around, you know, capitalistic ideas, etc.
Right.
Um, and so how do we kind of start to say like this is my like pod of people, and we're going to start there, right? And then that pod, if you want access in, be very explicit about the rules, right? Because what ends up happening is that can become a click really, really easily. And then, you know, people are trying to like get in or whatever. And you're like, well, you know, in 1992, that person did blah, blah, blah. And you're just like, oh,
Yeah.
you know, like, and
Yeah. The call
stuff
out
like,
culture, or yeah. I think about that all the time too, because I see it and I feel like to some degree in a soft way, I've experienced it too. It's just like the whole like um circling out of communities that happens, and not often reintroducing folks. And even if reintroducing folks to the community, there's always like this stigma left. And there's like this not allowing that person to sometimes even speak, but to like be a whole person, because like everyone in the community, like we all have stuff we're dealing with and like trying to heal and stuff. So like I don't know, yeah, sorry, that just hit a nerve for me.
No, but like it happens all the time. Like I've seen it in my own community, and like there's like a clique of people with vague rules of entry, right? And
Right,
you're constantly being tested on what I don't know,
right,
right? And then somehow you're accepted into the fold. Okay, cool, cool.
but you're on
And then
probation the whole time.
right, and then you can be like shunned for things that you don't even know because no one is like coming in to tell you like, well, this is the way, and they say that they're upfront or whatever, but like I'm just sitting there going like, this is not clear
Yeah,
about your rules of behavior and engagement, and like as someone with a brain injury and all that, I need boundaries, like not like to say that I'm very strict, but if I'm clear about my boundaries and you're clear about your boundaries, then that's how we can exist together. Like,
right,
if I don't know the shape of who I am, how am I like, you can't bleed into my shape? And we kind of accept that, right? Like, some of the things that we define as mental illness is really that individual doesn't know the shape of who they are. And so
yeah,
what they do is they try to kind of like melt into like some other individual, take on that identity, etc., and then wonder why it doesn't fit, right? And then
mhm,
they be acting all sorts of behaviors. What really is, it's like you have to understand the shape of who you are. And if
right,
some things aren't clear, at least you know where things are unclear, right? That's
yeah,
okay. Because part of growth is that becoming a whole human being is those boundaries get more clearly defined, right?
right,
And so, and sometimes they may change in shape, and that's okay too. But if you don't know what it is in the first place, how's it going to change, right? And so that then goes back to healing.
right,
So I think like as groups and as collectives, right? If your pod isn't really thinking on those lines, and again that goes back to accountability, how are we making sure that everyone is, you know, mutually growing, mutually, you know, doing what they need to do, right?
right,
That takes collective learning, that takes not just being together but doing together and seeing where, you know, friction and problems are happening to be able to communicate about like, this ain't working for me, or that ain't working for me. That happens and is only reserved for like romantic relationships, right?
right,
And then people understanding that when hurt happens, what kinds of hurt for you are non-negotiable, right? I don't do. I said to the other day, I don't do compromise because compromise is a power imbalance, right?
right,
Someone has to give up something, and it's usually the more vulnerable person that has to give up. I negotiate. So me as a whole human being, I say this is what I have. You say this is what I have. We can look at it and go like, is there enough of what we have in common where we can move forward together? And if it's not, then we can say, okay, that's okay. We're gonna keep it moving. But if you need something from me, if you need to, you know, help or whatever, pick up the phone because you know what I got and you don't have it.
yeah,
And we don't do that with each other, right?
yeah,
As soon as, you know, there's too much of a difference or whatever, it's conflict, people don't like each other, you know, and then, you know, we keep it moving. And I've literally
mhm,
had people not like me, but they're struggling with something, right? And they'll sit and they'll struggle with that thing rather than pick up the phone and say, I need help,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
We cannot survive as a species if we continue to do that behavior,
right.
right? I don't sit there and go like, this is for the children or what. No, screw the kids. Uh, and not in like, you know, like, oh, they're not important, but
Right,
I can't help the children if I'm not right. So like, you gotta figure out how to help this before you can say, well, we gotta do it. You know, we have to ensure that. Who's gonna ensure what if you messed up?
right,
Stop hiding behind these future children that you do not have, right? And start focusing on what is you here in the present to be able to move things forward. So, like healing, and we've been on that for a little bit, like it's so complicated,
mm,
right? And it's not. about bath bombs,
Right.
and you can journal until the cows come home. You can pray to whatever God you want till the cows come home. But if you're not living it, if it's not being exuded into who you are, what you do, how you speak, etc., then it's meaningless.
Right.
So I think like a lot of people, and I think especially like they'll abdicate things to like some sort of high, like, oh, is that like, well, no, like
It literally isn't.
you have to do something. I think I was at the Congressional Black Caucus thing last year, and it was amazing. I had never been around like that many Black people in my life. And one of the speakers at like the breakfast was like Howard Johnson. He's like from a line of pastors, and like I'm like, oh, okay, Baptist preacher, you know, whatever. And he was talking about like if all you're doing is praying and not doing any action,
Mhm.
then God ain't doing nothing for you, right? Because
Yeah.
it's about the prayer. You can pray all you want. And he gave all like these biblical examples of what happened when people were just like, oh, Jesus, God, help us. And God is like, okay, I actually gave you the skills in order to do it for yourself, right? So
Yeah.
you have to go out and do. And I was like blown away. I actually listened to their YouTube channel. I subscribe. So he's very interesting. And I'm like, not a Christian. So I think that's hilarious. And I'm just like, what is this guy going to say? But you know, thinking in that kind of radical way, that action, right, is a form of prayer, a form of godliness, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
we are, again, back to the principles. If we are aligned, right, part of righteousness, right, is one of the principles of Ma'at. If we're moving in that, right,
Right.
that is where, you know, I think we embody whatever principles of God or whatever that you want to believe in. You know, that is when it comes out. And part of some of the things that we're seeing is a lot of people calling themselves godly, right?
Right.
But yet acting in antithesis and anathema to community, right? Which is the absence of godliness,
Right.
and learning about things in a different way and seeing things in a different way. But that's how systems were made up to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Modern Christianity was born out of violence, right? And all these different things to subjugate people, right? Particularly Black and brown individuals, indigenous peoples. So to get back to what is good and right, you have to dismantle that that idea of like violence, etc., right?
Right.
You have to move back into community. You have to not be this isolated thing over here, right? Because we have many churches, but they're not, you know, doing what is needed to do to be within community, right?
Right.
And that could be for, you know, whatever denomination or whatever, right? So I think it's how do we kind of move back to all of that? How do we get back to that? And I think that is what is human and right. Like before all this existed, we lived in like these communal groups, right? You
Right.
know, live art, like you were just recognized as who you were. And what does that even look like in like this modern capitalistic structure that we have now? Like
Right.
that's like where things are going to be pretty interesting.
Right. As it falls apart, or maybe I hope it's falling apart, and I'm also nervous about it because it's the case of the first fucking time, right? It's like, um, and maybe it isn't necessarily the first fucking time, but it's like definitely a good deal of unlearning that we have to do. It's almost everything that we know is like has to be unlearned. I feel
Yeah.
like, um,
Everything, right? And
yeah,
like, and quickly, because I feel
yeah,
like every act of like when there's destruction, there is creation, right? They're kind of
yes,
both identical to each other. So I think you and I had this conversation a few years ago of like, what does being Black look like in the
Right.
absence of like racism, etc.
Right.
And um, I never wrote that thing for you. And I think it's because I'm still evolving of what that looks like. But I asked that in my circles, and people were shocked. These are people, many of them who have been working in like social justice. We gotta dismantle the system and all that. And they didn't even know, had never considered it. And I said, well, if we're working so hard to dismantle something and we don't understand the end goal that we're looking for,
Right.
right? Then how, like, it's kind of like at RIT when they would like build a building and then decide what to do after it. And I was like, that's too it's way too late. You can't like you gotta plan ahead. And if we're in this and we say we want to dismantle all these systems, but we've never considered where we're actually going towards,
Right.
then what are we doing? And we need to stop and actually really consider that. What do I look like without that struggle? Because I think as Black people, particularly, Black women, like so identify with the struggle, right? Like we wear it as like this badge of honor, this cape, we love to quote, oh, I work so hard, like, and that is just like, yes, look at us. We're like, "Ugh," and I'm like sitting there, I'm like, I don't want to struggle. Like,
Yeah.
I'm really not. It is not a fun thing, and I don't want my identity wedded to that.
Thank you
And
for that. Yeah.
like,
I've I've never said that out loud, and all of that. Like that's what I've always felt, cuz like I remember being asked that, but are you down with but what about our people? Are you down with our struggle? I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. I guess tell me. I like what do I need to know? Um, uh, and that's what it was. It was like I want to create a life for myself that in which I can live with myself in, and also where there is some degree of happiness. And I'm willing to like I'm doing a lot of work and stuff. And does that have to be my only story though? Is that
right,
I'm constantly struggling,
right,
like can't I enjoy something?
right. And we put that on like poor people all the time.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
how dare they buy shrimp,
Right.
fish? And I was like, but didn't y'all just say that was healthy food?
Right.
So Omega makes sense as to why we can't just buy the healthy food, right? Or how dare you wear good clothes? Well,
Right.
what if you got it from the Goodwill and it ain't none of your business?
Right.
Like, you're supposed to be poor and looking disheveled, etc., and you're
Right.
not getting treated well anyway. So, like, if you've got impossible standards for people, but we as Black people, oh, we love that. Oh my God, make our way out of nowhere and da da. I'm just sitting there going like, but what if? But what if? Right? And particularly with artists, like we love the narrative of like the starving, struggling artists,
Yeah.
thinking like that's where they're most creative. It's like no, you're
Oh,
most creative when you have resources
yeah.
and time,
That's
and
the truth.
you're not worried about the rent and how are you going to get the materials and like all of like this stuff, right?
Right.
So you've got to stop with I think that's another type of porn that we kind of fall into, right?
Mhm.
Like the story of the starving artist and that they come up through the ranks, and you're like, but that whole system is BS too, and run by like rich people.
Yes.
So it's like, if you really want to help an artist, sponsor them, right? Like,
Right.
pay rent. You've got a whole bunch of writers out there because I used to do that too. You could like get pennies for what you used to work for, and understanding that most of them are like fake writers anyway, supported by mommy and daddy. Right? You're just like, wait a minute, that's not cool, right?
Right.
And we've built up a whole entire subsets of industry on that you have to work two, three, four jobs and think you've got enough in you, because to be creative, to pour, a part of you out in that sort of way, it takes
Right.
energy, right?
Yep.
How you gonna do that if you're hungry? Like, how you
Right.
gonna do that if you're worried about like basic things like water and rent and like all of the stuff.
Right.
So it's just like we have to stop romanticizing things that are actually abusive and start moving towards that collective, what is good, what is right, and how do we do that and get everyone to move in that kind of way when
Right.
there's so much nuance, and we're not, even among like liberal circles, they're not used to thinking in that. I get a lot of pushback when I say, but liberals were fine with fascism. They were fine with it. And that, they just sit there like, what? I was like, you didn't care when Obama was putting kids in detention centers. Like, you didn't
Mhm.
care. And all of like, the cars, like the buses with the little kid seats, the car seats.
Yeah.
You're like, look at what Trump is doing. And I was like, I work in government. Contracts like that take a while. So I bet you that those contracts were done underneath the Obama administration.
Uh,
And then, to get like, that's what the cycle of government is. So you didn't care when, in this era, but now suddenly it's like everything is Trump fault. When most of what the government is, it's just like the same administration underneath Obama, underneath, Clinton, underneath Bush. Like these are like the same people, because only like a small top portion actually changes with
mhm.
presidency. So people don't want to think in those ways of how they were complicit and etc., or how like some of their behaviors and rhetoric sounds exactly identical to what people were saying during the Obama administration. I was like, you can't have it both ways.
Right.
And so, if we're going to change, we have to be able to say, are we actually willing to do that? Because my thought with liberals in this country, and there's data to support it, there was like a study that came out a couple years ago that said that Democrats aren't really interested in social change. They say they are, but they will only do it just enough, right, to like
Right. To be
some window
beneficial.
dressings, etc. But they're not interested in losing the power that they hold, right?
Right.
Actually hold many of the same ideals as like conservatives, right? And then you think of individuals like Buttigieg, right, who's basically a Republican,
Mhm.
but you had, oh my God, but he's gay. And I was like, so who cares?
Right.
He screwed over, a whole bunch of black trans individuals, right? Destroy their homes. But you're like, but he's progressive.
Mm.
How? Right? At the end of the day, it's still a white man in power.
Yeah.
And we need to stop like this whole just because you're gay, you're black, you're a woman, that somehow that
Yeah.
absolves of like anything. You can be just as shitty as white men, because you're still socialized in the same stuff. Like no one is free from that.
Right.
So I kind of look at it as not how likable. I don't care if a politician is likable. I care, are they able to push forward policies and make the changes that they need,
Right.
right? Like, I don't need to have a beer with my elected officials. Like, that is bizarre to me, right? And it also can be very sexist, because when you have Black women or brown women kind of coming up and they're like, well, she ain't likable. Well, based on what? What standard?
Right.
And how does that even fit into policy?
Right.
Because if you need to be likable in order to pass policy, then I think that there's a problem with the system in the first place, right? It shouldn't be some like popularity contest.
Right. It's like what changes are we making? Um my brain like split in 15 directions. Partially because I know I've been guilty of that too. And it's just like it's really easy to catch the flavor of the mob, right? And just be like, if we oust Trump, everything's gonna be okay. And of course that's not the only thing that that needs to happen. It's like again looking from every facet from the inside out in all directions. And there's like, you know, generally this one person who's swaying us either, you know, one direction or another. But there's all this internal work we need to be doing, our community work, and then on out from there. And that's I think that's a thing a lot of folks miss. And I can't remember. It was Lakoff. He writes about like the language of politics, and about how basically all of our needs are so similar, if not the same. Like we want security, we want power, we want to be able to, you know, live our lives in accordance with the way that we want to live them. And it just reminds me of how you're talking about like really knowing the shape of who we are, knowing the shapes of our communities, and knowing what we have on the table that's available to give. And obviously it's not from a deficit. Hopefully it's not from a deficit. These are the things we have to give. And so like learning how do we teach each other how to get there, like with our communities and stuff, to be able to be like these are our concerns and needs. And like how do we talk with each other, like these are the things that we have on the table and we can offer each other, and these are the places where we can meet. Like how what does that politics look like, because that's not the world we're living in.
Right.
That is, it's yeah.
How do you get there? Because, like, I'm fine with talking about deficits, right?
Hmm.
But the way that people talk about deficits is like so dehumanizing.
Yes, yeah.
If there's a hole, we don't say that the problem is with the hole, right? We figure out what does the hole need. Maybe you need a tree, maybe you need some flowers, you know,
Mhm.
maybe there was an earthquake, right? And it
Right,
created the hole, right?
right,
Maybe bad construction and it created the hole. Like we don't talk about that when it comes like to human beings, right? Like
right.
I as a human being, there's always going to be deficits, right? But
Hmm.
it's about like how do those deficits get met,
Right,
right? A that's empowering to the individual. Some of it is I might be ignorant, which nobody likes to say, but
right.
I'll just say it. Like we are all ignorant about something. That is called being a human being, right?
An
And so
opportunity for
that's a
growth.
deficit. You know, the answer to that is education,
Right,
right? So what kind of access do I need in order to meet that deficit, right? And what are the tools that other people are going to do to support me while I learn and grow,
right.
right? So we don't see it as that. It's like, oh, it's a deficit. You need to be fixed. You're the reason that it
Yep,
exists in the first place. You. And then you get like white people over there going like, and we are the saviors
you're right,
to fix you,
right,
not knowing that they are the problem. And right.
right.
And we, you know, have also deficits and are only seeing like, I think, what is it, the whole like Christian saying, you're trying to pick a toothpick out of someone else's eye when there's a telephone pole in your own, right? So good at doing that to each other without
Hmm.
realizing that, you know, we got some stuff.
Right,
So it kind of goes back to healing. How do you mutually support each other? Um, and how do you accept? Because that's the other thing. I have a hard time accepting help.
yeah,
Um,
same.
and that is just like, oh, I got to do it on my own and na, na, na.
Yeah,
And
people
on the,
essentially have started hiring me to do things so they can help me.
that is a great, great way of going about it, right? So how do we like learn, because the thing about I think I've learned from being disabled, right? Just because I have a caregiver does not mean I'm not independent,
Right,
right? It means that that individual is doing things for me so that I can do the things that I need to do for myself and focus on the things that I can do for myself. And that we talk more about like independence dependence, right?
right.
And that if you're too enmeshed with someone, you're codependent, right? And that leads back to codependency is not understanding your own shape, right?
Yeah.
And so you're just kind of bleeding and, you know, you're like two amoebas and you're just like, right?
Right.
rather than saying what is interdependence, because that is the
Mhm.
heart of what being in community is. I'm an independent being, you're an independent being, and so the thing is that we need to rely on each other, right? Because interdependence is something that goes both ways. Dependence is a one-way interaction, right? And so, and codependence is an unhealthy interaction.
Right,
So we need to get to what the healthiness is. It's like recognizing that interdependence is what helps you be a well-rounded human being. And we do this with many, many things, right? But not understanding like it's got to be this holistic view of
right,
interdependence, right? I don't have the ability to grow my own food. So I go to the grocery store, right?
right,
And I my hard-earned coins in order to do that, right? In a non-capitalistic society, it would still be the grocery store, right? But maybe I'm giving my time, my labor, something like that, right? In
right,
order to get back, right?
right,
You need money to exchange goods,
right, right.
right? You need
There's
trust.
yeah, there are some places trying that in the restaurant form. Like there's this place here called Same Cafe. And you pay, it's sliding scale. You pay what you can or what you feel like the meal is worth. And if you can't pay, you trade time. You trade time cleaning or cooking, and then you get a meal. And I think that's such like that is so cool because then everyone gets a meal, right? And I would love to see more of that because that's the thing is I don't see any lack. There's there's excess, and it's just like ever since like that high school economics class where they talked about that whole thing that we do where when America has excess they take it and dump it on a country that's already poor, and somehow this excess is still inaccessible to the poor country and it decreases the value of their economy. And that it still doesn't make sense to me because this excess is like it's just rotting in a field somewhere. and
Yes,
and that's the thing is like there are people hungry or whatever, and maybe in some moments we do need to be dependent, and that should be okay because we have capacity for it. There's excess, right? Instead of dumping it or whatever, we make people strong so that they can get on their feet and then be able to you know what they have to offer again because their brains are functioning again and their bodies are functioning again. But anyway, like all of this, it doesn't make sense to me. It's just like all I see is abundance, and somehow often it's inaccessible somehow to the people who need it the most. And so like I got away from what we were talking about a tiny bit, but that's what happens in my head. I'm like, none of this makes sense. It doesn't make sense at all because like everything is available, and like how do we create the bridge to get it to the right people, or like it's just like it's that whole thing. Like I have an excess of Q-tips for example, in real life right now I have hundreds of Q-tips I'm never going to use. Thanks Costco, right? And it's just me. I barely ever use Q-tip. And you just put a call out and like, is there someone doing some kind of project, or is someone willing to help me put together care packs for people who can actually use these things so they're just not taking up space in my bathroom and getting dust balls on them, um and um and then that happens, someone actually appears, who's going to use this pot that I'm not using, because it's a very nice iron Dutch oven, right? And somebody wants that, somebody needs that, um
yeah.
etc. And it works that way for me too.
I've been seeing that, like no buy kind of community groups, etc., that are still kind of new and forming, and all that good stuff. And we saw this with COVID. Farmers, right? Their fields still needed to, be
Yep.
picked, but then you've got all the stuff rotting, and so they were having to. But because of the system and how laws were created, it was not very easy for them to just give this excess over here, right?
Right.
So people are like, the supply chain broken. And I was like, it been broken,
Yeah, it's
right?
been
Like, so
broken.
like it was designed that way. So for me, it wasn't broken. It's just the way it was designed to be,
Right.
right? So, and these are things that people have been saying for years, which nobody wanted to pay attention to because, oh, that's a fringe thing over here. And I was like, but it's still racism
Right.
because we talk about food deserts all the time, and food deserts exist where there are farmers with fields rotting, right? Not too far away. So
Right.
how get the food into the food desert, right? And shifting that. We had like milk giveaways. Like there was one just
Right.
last week because the farmers could not um like the supply chain was gone, so they were like just giving it away for free. So and then even like how we produce, like I love milk, I love cheese and all that, but like even how that is done in this country is like abusive and gross and
Right.
all, right? It's not like you shouldn't eat beef, but like can we treat these genetically designed animals in a way that is like healthy, good, and right,
Right.
and not like you're pumping someone full of hormones, you're now drinking their byproduct, right? Like you're getting
Right.
the hormones and then you're wondering why, things are happening. And we're pumping them full of hormones to meet some weird supply demand that might actually be artificial,
Right.
instead of saying like there is more than enough food for everyone in this country,
Right.
right? And in other places there's more than enough food to support the people, but like you think of quinoa, right? And it's now being
Right. We're
exported.
eating it. Yeah.
You know,
It just gets transported to folks who yeah. That's the thing is like wherever we live, ultimately all the nutrients we need, if we were living in accordance with, all the nutrients we need are from our surroundings, and we've
right.
royally fucked that up.
There, and we've gotten used to getting things out of season,
Mhm.
etc. And some crops can be grown all seasons long, right? And I'm okay with that, right? But at the same time, we need to find ways to get back to seasonal eating,
Mhm.
right? Because I think that's more enjoyable. I really
Mhm.
love clementines when they come, at a certain time,
Right,
right? I don't want to see them year round, like because
right.
like
It's
they're
not the same. Yeah, it's a different, like, I really enjoy like August, September because it's like hatch green chili season and peaches, right? And when you have them all year round, just kind of the laissez-faire peaches or whatever, they're not the same. They're not sun warmed. They're like, maybe they won't even ripen correctly. But just having them all the time, it almost takes away that, yeah, there's a certain joy that happens, like, oh, this is the season, I'm gonna go up and get those palisades. And
yeah.
like it's just like we've lost a lot of that. Like I remember seeing watermelon in the grocery store in December, and I was very confused and not I it didn't sit right with me. I'm like, no, 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 this isn't right.
Like Mexico or some crap like that. And so instead
Right.
farming what is like indigenous to them. And I like this idea of like regional foods. Like, in order to get, a Vidalia onion, I shouldn't be able to get that here in Rochester, right? There should
Yeah.
be ways for people to like explore, share, etc. So like you can experience the breadth of food without all like the huge transportation, yada yada yada,
Yeah.
uh, kind of stuff, and being mindful of like scurvy and all
Right.
that. But like, there are so many other things other than citrus that can give you vitamin C. So it's just like because we don't have, and again, indigenous minded folk, right? Indigenous peoples understood this.
Yeah.
Like I have never heard from lore or whatever of indigenous people getting scurvy. So what are they eating in order to supplement the diet with different things, right?
Right.
How are we going back to the land, etc., honoring the animals, etc.? If you take a life of an animal, That's a very sacred thing, right? And so it should be treated with respect. You utilize the whole parts of the animal for, your life or whatever.
Right.
And that's kind of how I want to move and groove, right? I don't like
Right.
that. I know so many people who, oh, but I only eat chicken breast. I don't like, meat with the bone in it because, like, ugh, that's gross or whatever. And I'm just sitting there going, like, how do you think the chicken breast got? Like,
Yeah.
they into a whole entire creature, right?
Right. Well, not
But
to mention you can make an amazing broth if you save those bones, and that's where tons of nutrition is. So,
exactly. So when we are so removed even from our food,
mm-hmm.
but we're also so removed from ourselves, right?
Right.
Don't touch yourself, etc. Like we're
Right.
socialized, you know, to see even different parts of ourselves as like taboo. And then we wonder, and then we're also socialized that, certain behaviors are only allowable in certain situations, right? But then when we get in those situations, we don't know how to act, right? And we wonder why things happen. I was like, but if it started back there. So we have to teach our children to start seeing themselves and being in a way that is holistic, right?
Right.
Nothing wrong with a vulva. There's nothing wrong with a
Oh,
penis. There's
right.
nothing wrong with any of all these different things, right? Boobs are great. Um, but at the same time, if we don't like accept that people can also be different than their parts,
Right.
right? I, as someone who doesn't identify as either cis or trans, right? Sometimes that can be a bit of a mental like ugh, for me, and learning to live like it's okay to have this body, right?
Yeah.
That a vehicle and a tool for myself, and that is okay. For me, my body does not have to match myself, right?
Right.
And that was part of my own kind of like healing journey because
Yeah.
I'll be damned if I have another surgery. um, but I think a lot of the times we have dysphoria in our society because the society itself does not accept this fact. Like,
Right.
look at different African tribes, et cetera, that accept transness, et cetera. There's no, body modification surgery. Like, they don't
Right.
have that, right?
Right.
Uh, it's not a thing that exists. They just accept the person as they are.
Right.
And I feel like dysphoria wouldn't be the thing that it is if society accepted people as they are.
Right.
But that takes like a shift,
Right.
right? Cultural thinking, because I think that claiming of the binary and making sure that structure exists is a power dynamic, right?
Right.
If I have said that certain types of beings are inferior and have created whole entire systems in order to subjugate that, but now we've got a shift saying, well, no, that's not true, right? That's a loss of power and control. So I
Right.
think that's kind of where the inherent thing is that we don't really talk about as a whole.
It,
Um,
I love that you're talking about this. These are words I haven't been able to articulate for myself. And so I really appreciate you're so fucking awesome. Like on all these different scopes, like you're just thinking of it from like the holistic point of view. And it makes me so happy because like, obviously I'm seeing a lot of my friends experience dysmorphia in varying degrees, and then also struggling with folks who are very transphobic too, who refuse to do accept other people's pronouns and new names, or chosen names, I should say, and just like that feeling too. I have a similar feeling of just like I know that I'm somewhere on the spectrum where I'm supposed to define myself somehow or some way, or appear some way, or align somehow with my appearance, and I don't really feel any of those ways that are being laid out for me to define myself in, right? And like just being like I'm okay with anyway. This is the part of it that we're not talking about. There are all these liminal spaces that I know I'm particularly interested in because I find myself in so many of them as well. And we don't talk about them. We're always like speaking almost always in some kind of binary or an offshoot of that binary. Like there's like a fan of a spectrum, but not the whole spectrum. And I don't even know if spectrum is really the right word because like there are so many different ways of experiencing and thinking and living, and they should all be accepted, right? I don't know. I'm just like I just really appreciate this talk so much, because you're so incredibly clear and on every aspect of it. Um, I just really admire that.
I think like, thank you.
Yeah,
Sometimes I don't feel that way, but I think that has been the result of a lot of like introspection, right?
yeah,
And then also, I had like a huge brush with death 3 years ago. And I think that helps you to get clear about some things, right?
mhm,
And really get clear about who you are as like a person and, and all that. And then
yeah,
you make a lot of promises, a lot of promises. And what often happens when you get to the other side, like those promises go by the wayside.
right,
And I've been very like intentional to not have that happen, right? To know that like life was something that was, given to me to do as I want with it. I think like that is like that's where free will comes in. It's like your life to live and your life you get to choose, right? But at the same time, hopefully I'm choosing in a way that uplifts everyone else,
yeah,
that enriches my own life, and that even about my own identity, who I was, etc. Really have to asking like, what is non-binary? What is trans? Like, why
hmm,
do we only see certain types? Like, I see certain like clothing lines and like this is a non-binary clothing line. And I was like,
right,
well, that looks like the men's section at J.C. Penney.
right,
So
exactly.
I do
Real
not
talk,
gravitate towards that, or else I would be shopping in the men's section of J.C. Penney.
right?
So if I don't fit that, but yet these are the things, that I'm like really drawn to, like, but then understanding that color doesn't have a sex assignment to it, right?
Right,
Like pink is just pink.
right.
And like under like removing that, like I don't know anyone who doesn't like shiny things. Like my brothers even go like, ooh, and I was like, yeah, you should wear it. And they're like, ooh. So because we used to play dress up like together. So like, children do this
Mhm,
naturally and then it gets socialized onto them to
right,
create, segregation and whatnot. So we have to stop thinking in how like, and I think part of what we see is what is trans, what is non-binary, etc., is kind of like put out there to be palatable
right,
to straight white people,
right.
right? Because their brains really do melt when presented with like complexity, uh,
Mhm,
as a result of their own socialization, right?
right.
And also to get the same kind of clarity. I mean, cool that you know exactly who you are, the kind of things that you want to be, and you've gone, this boop, awesome. um that's a cool way to be, but it is also cool to be something else,
Right.
right? And again, that making people conform to one way of being doesn't work.
No.
And it doesn't like we should be conforming to societal attitudes, morals, right? Values, etc. Like that allows you to express yourself as an individual while still, behaving and moving according to, a greater common good, right?
Right.
So, and again, that diffusion of power, um, that people of a certain bent they have an expectation that everything was built and made for them, right? And to do differently feels uncomfortable, right?
Uh-huh.
As it should. But rather than, leaning into the uncomfortableness of it, people will react and be like, no, I wanted to protect this space. And that is what the root of homophobia and all that other stuff kind of tends to be. rather than, and that hatred is learned, right?
Right.
As a power dynamic that they're trying to institute and take control over, right?
Right.
And power over others, right? You being who you are threatens who I am because maybe they've never considered who they were in the first place, right?
Right. Right.
Drifting along, and then now you're confronted with something and you're like, whoa, maybe what I've been told my whole entire life was a lie.
Right.
And rather than, confront the lie, they blame it on the individual, right?
Right.
They'd rather, harm the individual than say, what is it that I'm doing to myself, right? I'm
Right.
not doing myself. I think like, excuse me, we were talking, what is it? Dominique Jackson, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The beautiful woman who is in Pose, right? She came to Rochester.
Yes. Yeah.
Talking about how much of the violence against trans women that she was seeing was coming from straight men who were dating trans women to use them for the money that they were getting from sex work, etc. And talking about the violence, which I had never heard before. Like the violence is more of, I'm gonna get caught, right? I'm gonna be seen as not the straight tough guy. Da, 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 da. Like it's
Yeah.
rooted in something like, and we don't talk about the deeper things, right? We only just push for like hate crime legislation, which doesn't prevent the crime from happening in the first place. So it goes back to, healing and how are we, including straight people, have to like start thinking about themselves. Maybe everyone is a little bit gay, right?
Right. Right.
Maybe that's okay too,
Yeah.
right? If you see your dude and you see another dude and you're like, he's fine, like that
Okay. Yeah.
right? Like that's just like saying his shirt is red, right? That
Right.
needs to be like as commonplace and people being okay. But right now they're like, it's a threat to my sexuality and my power and I'm gonna like we can't again, it goes back to that survival. Like people I think are starting to slowly wake up to that, but without like nuance, without all of that, I think it ends up being terrible. Like it's just terrible. And then we're not showing up for our Black trans sisters in the way that we like. We'll protest for George Floyd, right? But we won't, for a trans woman who's murdered, and like most of us can't even like say their names.
Right.
So like a lot of that for me, that's like another part of like healing and growth is to be able to talk about, all of these things because we're not showing up for each other in the ways that we need to. And that even within society, like Black men, they've got a lot of healing to do.
Yeah.
And if we're also being homophobic, transphobic, within our rhetoric for liberation, then what we want is not liberation, it's parity with white men. And that is not what I want. I don't want parity with white men. I want something different,
Yeah.
something, hopefully better, right? That we can all experience and be better, and that each one of us can live our authentic lives without fear of like retribution. We see all these different, like the panic laws, and all that stuff. I'm just sitting there going like, I just, how can you treat another human being in that way
Right.
that felt like so threatened by the existence of who they are that you would kill them? Like,
Right.
what? And that society upholds that. And
Right.
it's like, what? We do that to disabled people too,
Yep.
right? It's, they are often killed by their family members, particularly a parent. And then it's like, oh, but the poor parent, they were such a burden and all this. And it's like, well, we're not talking about like, why didn't the family help?
Right.
Where were the friends, right? Where was the community support in order to uplift that whole family and take on like caregiving? Like caregiving shouldn't be like this burden. It should be a shared thing, right? So do we wonder why violence is enacted in such different ways that people feel trapped, burdened, or whatever? But we didn't do, like, we'll just see it as outside of ourselves, right? And not how do we contribute to that happening? We didn't
Right.
care enough about that disabled life to do more, right? We abdicated responsibility to someone else and be like, you do it. And we're not going to give you the supports, da, 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 da. And then we're going to talk about crap about that disabled individual, right? Rather than looking at ourselves and say, how do we contribute to this?
Right.
And it's like, we do that so quickly to very specific groups of people. And it's like right in front of us. You know, if we're not talking about all Black Lives Matter, then what are we doing? And that is inclusive. And if we're not leading, I think I said this on one of my, inspirational posts, like, what books are you reading? If
Right.
all your kind of like anti-racist books are all heterosexual
Right.
cisgender people, then you've got a problem because you're purposely now going out and indoctrinating yourself with one point of view
Right.
and then saying, oh, but we center the marginalized. We center them. Do you even know what that means?
Right.
I don't think most people do know what that means.
I don't think so either.
It's just such and like, it's okay if you don't know,
Right.
right? You don't have the lived
Well,
experience,
that's
a trans person.
right.
That's fine. But please pay the trans women, right, to come in and educate you. And then
Yes.
now that you've been educated, you should be bringing that along into whatever it is that you do. Like, that's a missing piece to like all of this. Pay people for their labor and their expertise, because that's what we do, right?
Yeah.
I can't fix a car. I'll pay someone for their expertise, right, to do it for me.
Hmm.
So the aim is with our own education and development. And it's like, how do we shift things from like this fear of the unknown and different and like different from us to embracing it and saying like, wow, that's amazing. You are an amazing human being and you have so much to give to this world just by being who you are,
Right.
right? Like, and how do we like how I still don't know how I do, like, I'm trying, but I'm like, how do we do this?
How? Well, with that, like even though there are all these questions, you talk about having this very clear goal that you're moving towards and like breaking it down from there. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how do you get to that clarity? Because most of us are spinning our wheels and we're just moving and just like all over the place. And it's some kind of movement. It might get somewhere we are not sure. But like, how do you make that clarified space up in front of you?
I think I've had a lot of clarity of vision, but not clarity of movement. I think those like two different things.
Mhm.
I was doing a lot of things. Like, if you see my CV, I've done a lot, right? But it was not with the clarity. It's like popcorn here,
Yeah,
here,
yeah,
here. And it took that like life event to be able to say, I have only so much energy, right? If this is like the end goal and you only have so much time, so much energy, like, you have to focus on the things that you know how to do and do them well, right? And be okay with the things that you can't really do well, because that has to be a question of, do I have the time and energy to learn a new skill? And if the answer is no, then I need to invest in people who have that skill to
yes,
bring them into the vision and so that we can move forward. So I think like a lot of that has been that introspection, right? To be able to say, like, this is who I am, like, this is what I got. If I can't even answer the this is what I have, I can't really move forward. So the thing about, recovering from, near death is that you have a lot of time on your hands in order to kind of make that happen.
yeah,
So, and then I set out for myself like clear goals and like priorities.
yeah,
And I have to, and I think for me is I do a daily check-in, right? Both morning and evening, and then, weekly goals, monthly goals, like all, like how is what I'm doing actually aligning to the end goal over here? And if I'm taking on, because I love to say yes to things, as you can see, um, if I'm saying yes too many times, right? Because
Yeah.
I love being interested in multiple different things, but that also can burden you from actually getting, things done.
Right.
So what does that look like, and how am I aligning, and how am I behaving, and making sure that I am clear on myself, my personal mission, but also like that bigger goal. Like for the initiative that I had a vision of what it would look like in practice. And I can tell you that, despite turmoil, bullying, like all the stuff that came, like things are coming to fruition that I had spoken about, years ago,
Right.
which is great. And some of it has been getting out of my own way to allow things to happen. And I think, for me, you call it prayer, whatever you want to do, how you center yourself, because when you have clarity of vision and now clarity of movement, there's a lot of pushback, right?
Mhm.
People want to pull you into this, that, and the third,
Yep.
or get very, very upset at when you say no. For me, that's a distraction. I always say that. Like when I'm saying that something is a distraction, it's a very clear, um, to everybody. Like I have a mission to accomplish. Y'all got to leave me alone. If that's your thing or whatever, do you? I support you, right?
Yeah.
But I've got to, it's kind of like in football, you're carrying the ball, you're trying to get into the end zone, and then there's people trying to tackle you and you're spinning around and it might not look like you're moving forward, but like you are, right?
Right.
So that's how I felt things, and that there's been a strategy at play in order to get things moving. So we're now seeing the fruition of like that strategy. And also, I think for me is finding those who are my co-conspirators.
Yes.
A
Yeah.
lot of the time that I was doing things, I was doing it by myself, being that lone voice, speaking up, popping up, right? And that's actually a problem. When you are the only one speaking up in certain spaces, right? And you don't have anyone to have your back, that's how you're a target,
Yep.
right? And either the system or individuals are going to take you out. Like, bless Dr. King. However, right, that is how movements get targeted. So it's not about being like leaderless, because that's not um, a thing. It's having multiple leaders at multiple levels doing multiple things,
Right.
like uplifting the skills that they have in order to move forward. So, like, if there's 20 Lutitias, you take me out, cool, cool, things are still going to move forward, right?
Mhm.
So I don't have like that worry as much about being kind of like the lone person in the room. And I think what I've been doing now more is speaking out about the things that have been happening, and not holding my tongue to protect someone else's reputation, especially when what they're doing is wrong and harmful to the community, right?
Right.
Doing that in a very strategic way, because I still need my job.
Right. Well,
uh,
you also mentioned earlier, like sometimes you let things unfold. Sometimes there's a time to like absolutely speak, and sometimes you let it unfold.
yeah,
So like, can you like what I know you can't give a probably a specific example, but just like loosely, like what does that look like? Because I think that's another place we're in too right now, is like we got to call it out right now, and then it's like self-destruct mode, and all of a sudden, and everything crumbles. Sometimes organizations and stuff too. But I am also a very strong believer in we all make mistakes, and there are things that happen, and some of us are really true to whatever we say we are true to. Some of us are not, and I do believe that all becomes apparent over time. And so, like, sometimes it's imperative to make a stop to something. But like, can you talk a little bit about that unfolding, like letting it
yeah.
unfold?
I think that is what discernment really is,
Mm-hmm.
knowing when to speak and when to not, and
Mm-hmm.
being strategic where you speak and how you speak and what you say,
Mm-hmm.
right? And one, I think that's a function of age.
Yeah.
Um, because sometimes I think you have to fail your way through it, right?
Mm.
And then like learn some lessons, which is unfortunate, but I think like sometimes experience is that's kind of where things are made, right? And others is if I do not have control of the situation, right? I have no ability to influence or, do whatever. And if it's outside of the lane that I like, if it's outside this very clear path that I have seen for myself, then like you're gonna have to let it be and let it do what it do. And also, I think this is where relationships come into play because sometimes people do see things and they're not willing to say anything.
Right.
And so that's where you have to have relationships for people to be able to say, yeah, and in spaces that I can't be in spaces that, I have no power and control, like let others speak,
Yeah.
right? I don't need to be, and I think this is that ego thing. People always want to be like rah, rah, rah at every meeting and I have time for that anymore. And it's unproductive, right? And I think I've gotten the reputation now that when I speak on something, that it means that I have considered it, read as much as I can, understood, and so I'm speaking from a place of understanding and to try and move something, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes speaking up and how is by asking a question, right? Why did you say that? Oh, that's interesting. Tell me where that comes from. What made you think in that sort of way, right? So it's not me like I feel like I'm proselytizing this whole entire recording.
No,
It's
no.
kind of like we're preaching, right? But allowing another person to maybe see what their error is, right,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that recognizes their own humanity, right? Because we're all human.
Right.
But also that I'm curious as to where your point of view is coming from. Now, that's not always successful, right? People will still see it as like a thread, but I think
Right.
like this is how I'm kind of the less energy I have, the less time I have to put that energy in spaces where it's unproductive.
Right. Amen to that. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for this. I have to close it up soon. But I want to thank you for your time so much and for this talk. I have a lot to think about and I'm really excited about this talk too, because I feel like a lot of just I don't feel like you're proselytizing. Like you said, you actually are thinking about these things. And like I said, and every time I think about like how you're thinking about it, I literally see a globe, and like there are all these points of connections, as many points as possible from the inside to all the way to the outside and beyond. And it's just that's so cool to see, because I feel like most folks truly compartmentalize, and they think this compartmentalization is going to affect the whole, but this holistic understanding, we need more of that. We need more of that. We need so much more of that all day every day. And yeah, so like how can people support your work and the stuff you're doing? We didn't get to talk about your writing or your books, and I really wanted to do that too. And we can always do a part two.
Sure.
Um, and yeah, how do people do that?
I think first, there is a website and you can kind of see the work that I'm doing at the governmental level.
Hmm.
And I think secondly is that if you are like in protest or whatever, try to find the people. I think there's more people like me that exist in government. I know that they exist, and I know that they are struggling. And it's important to try and find those people and ask how can we be co-conspirators together. I think like if that could happen, I would like be so happy because then it would be like this network, right?
Right.
And using the tools that I've kind of put together to kind of like help over here is like a big thing. And also, you know, supporting people who are artists, people who are kind of in community with each other. It would be great to see all these different like healing circles or
Yes.
whatever. It would be great if like emotional emancipation circles were like expanded, right, to across. So reaching out to them and saying, how do I bring this to my community, and identifying people in order to go through that. I do not believe money is a barrier. It's out there. It's about how do we access all of this for the things that we need,
Mhm.
right? And really just kind of saying with yourselves to say, and hopefully I've asked a lot of questions that people can kind of like write down and then continually evaluate yourself. Like, how
Yeah.
are you moving? You know, what is your vision for yourself
Right.
and for your community, and are you moving in that way? Because, and if you can't pull people in, right, then asking yourselves how. And I think
Right.
like that for me, if people could do that on a regular basis and have like this thought analysis that, you know, because I try to model what it is that I want other people to do. So
Right.
you know, folk watch this and they say, okay, how do I start thinking in these kinds of ways? Because
Right.
I used to be a very like compartmental person, and part of that healing is to understand that that was how I was protecting myself from hurt and harm and whatever.
Right.
And now, for me, being vulnerable is to open yourself to all these possibilities, looking at these connections, saying, you know, maybe I don't have that skill set, and
Right.
being okay with that, and finding people, quality people, because like just because you might have a skill doesn't mean you're good at it, right?
Right.
How do you discern that people are actually good at what they do? And if they're not, how do we find what they're good at to be able to utilize them so that they can help build and grow themselves? So I think like it starts at the personal level of understanding the shape of who you are, and then saying, do you understand the shape of the people who are around you? And once we know that, we'll be able to collaborate and grow together, right? So
Awesome.
that's how I would frame things, and it's also the title of the book. The shape of who I am is the title of my book. So like
I
to
was
be
about to ask you for some book recommendations, actually. Like, if I up to five, if you have five, like, what should people be reading?
So I am going to always shout out my friend Yasmin Nair, and she is just like this badass lady. And so you can find her writing on her website, and it's easily Googleable. Just type in her name, and it like her last name looks like Nair, but it's Nair.
Mhm.
Um, and so I highly recommend her. And she also recommends like current affairs. I just read an article this morning, and every single thing that they write is just amazing. Another disabled activist is Imani Barbarin. And so she, I think, just got a book deal, which is awesome. So to be able to follow her like on Twitter, on Facebook, etc., that's like someone I definitely want to highlight. And then there's a book called Care Work by Leah Lakshmi. She's also another disabled justice activist. And she talks about the history of disability justice, the intersections of care as labor, and like it's a mind-blowing book that I think should be a staple for like everybody, right? And all these are like unknown people, but
Yeah.
I would recommend all those folk first.
Okay.
um, it's just kind of starting there and then seeing what they recommend, because I think like each one of them has like different recommendations on who else to read and go to.
Yeah.
So like that is, if we're gonna center, you know, folk, etc., that's kind of where it starts. And I think Kim Tallbear also is pretty awesome, and she has like a lot of YouTube videos, etc. So really kind of looking at all of those. I'm trying to currently read through a couple of different books by trans activists, etc. So I haven't finished them yet, so I don't want to give an opinion until like I'm done. But I probably will be shouting them out on like Instagram, etc., just to be able to say like these are some other artists, because that was like a gap in my learning too, is
Yeah.
to really read more about, you know, trans individuals from different types of communities. So that's kind of what I've been embarking on. So I'm trying to tell people I am trying to live the things that I say that, you know, other
Yeah.
people are doing. So
Amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, even when I ask you how we can support you, it's still community minded. It's like by supporting the community, you are also supporting me as community. And I thought
yeah.
a really neat thing that just happened. um,
I could also pimp my own business, I guess. Like,
yes.
if you're still struggling, Catalyst Consulting 18 at gmail.com is, I'm building up my website right now, but like, I'm the only Luticha Doucette that exists in the world. So it's pretty easy to find me. So just reach out. Please don't reach out at my government email asking me to work for you privately. That's
Right.
illegal, and I do not want that. But you can find me on Instagram, you can find me on Facebook, etc., and that's how I'll accept. But if you email me on my job to hire me privately, I'm going to tell you no. So,
Yeah.
because I need that respect and that I do things by the book. So,
Cool. Cool. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to close this up.
all right. Cheers.
Thank
Bye.
you.